In nature, fire and rain are part of the cycle of life. Rain nourishes the earth and promotes a successful harvest. Fire provides warmth and comfort and helps to regenerate forests fatigued by overgrowth. But too much rain or fire burning out of control can bring tragedy instead, when a hot July day sparks death and destruction for settlers trying to carve a dream out of Canada's northern forest. And heavy rains transform a gentle creek into a raging river that changes forever the life of the Midwestern American city through which it flows. More than 1 million square kilometers in size, Ontario is Canada's second largest province. More than 80% of it is covered by some variety of forest. In the late 1800s, the immigration of European settlers to Ontario's northern regions increases dramatically. So does the threat of fire, as communities develop faster than the services set up to protect them. One example of this is the clay belt that stretches between the towns of Matheson and Cochrane, a few hundred kilometers north of North Bay. Here, homesteads spring up all along the Temiskaming rail line as settlers turn patches of forest into farmland.
Surveys were done, including the ones around Matheson, where the clay belt had been discovered. This was a region that was supposed to be good for farming development. Matheson itself would have been a service town for the area. It had a few hundred residents by this time. A small town growing to serve the surrounding area in which farmers were settling and agricultural development was taking place.
It had its share of fires along the way, as every small town, with the wooden structures.
Fire becomes a fact of life in the Matheson area, and sometimes death. In July 1911, fire sweeps through the communities of South Porcupine and Cochrane, destroying 1,600 square kilometers of forest. It kills 70 people and leaves 3,000 homeless. But the worst is yet to come. 1916. The world has been at war for 2 years. In Canada, stories from the front lines fill the front pages of the nation's newspapers. The summer of 1916 reminds many Northerners of another summer 5 years earlier. Heavy rains in May and June give way to one of the hottest Julys on record. Settlers take advantage of the dry weather to burn away heavy brush.
Forest fires were common because settlers were clearing the land, and so you would see smoke all the time. And people became rather blasé about it because there was always smoke, there was always fire. It was just a fact of life.
Many settlers take comfort in the fact that since 1911, larger sections of forest have been cut or burned. Some towns have their own water tower and volunteer fire brigade.
Fire management was largely a matter of fire control at the time. In the summertime, railways had accepted the obligation to have fire rangers along their lines and to do their best to put out fires whenever they occurred.
July 29th, 1916. Another hot, dry, smoky day.
Fires had been burning in the region for the past 2 weeks. The locomotive engineers were rolling through this area, spoke of the fires that they noted, the smoke that prevailed, the heat that was also marking these days.
Crown Land Agent Frank Ginn has his concerns. Before leaving for his office in nearby Matheson, he tells his family to take refuge in a nearby swamp should fire come close to the house. On a farm just outside Matheson, William Dowson helps a neighbor mix concrete for cement blocks. He notices that the cement has no trouble drying in the intense heat.
And At 11 o'clock a.m., we were forced to close work on account of the high winds, which kept steadily increasing. We took shelter in the tool shed, where we had lunch and sat chatting.
For Simon Aumont, it's another sweltering day working his quarter section near the village of Nushka.
My mother was the 7th child of a family of 10. Her father was Simon Lawrence Aumont, and she had 5 brothers and 4 sisters. The youngest was 4 months old and the oldest was 16 years old.
Not far away, residents attend Mass in Nushka.
It was a very small town. A lot of French-Canadian families had moved from Quebec. They were working on building a church and having their own church.
The new priest in town, Father Wilfred Gagné, leads the service. Father Gagné has just attended a retreat in the south and was urged by colleagues not to return home because of the fire risk.
And as the day advanced, people went out and about their affairs, went shopping and so on. Noted the smoke, but rather took it for granted until the middle of the day when it suddenly became clear that the smoke was thicker.
One of the workmen called our attention to a black cloud far over the treetops. We all decided it was a thundercloud, so paid no more attention to it, until a wave of heat and a thick pall of smoke struck the shed with such force that it almost collapsed.
Suddenly they became aware of more heat, and the roaring of the flames suddenly becomes audible, and they begin to realize that the small fires have joined together into a much larger one.
Wind is the culprit, whipping smaller fires into one ravenous monster that moves relentlessly towards the communities of the clay belt. July 29th, 1916. Homesteader William Dowson races along the railway tracks not far from the town of Matheson, Ontario.
When I passed through Matheson, the men were preparing for the fight. Every available utensil that would hold water was being filled by the wagons, drawing it from the Black River, which runs through the town.
Matheson wouldn't have had very much in the way of fire fighting equipment. They had the river, and if the flames really appeared to threaten the community and people's lives, people could always head for the river and get into it.
What the citizens of Matheson can't foresee is the incredible wind that feeds on the flames and increases its own velocity as it pushes the fire forward. It is not so much a fire as a firestorm.
An irresistible front of flame is soon developed, and it sweeps forward, devouring the forest before it like the dry grass in a running prairie fire.
In minutes, Matheson is in the eye of a blazing storm.
You would have thick smoke. You would have flying embers. And I can envision with the wind and the noise of the fire, it would be terrifying.
Land agent Frank Ginn is part of a group of townspeople who head for the Black River. Some huddle beneath the bridge, trying to hide from the heat and smoke. Others take to the river, its waters seething in the firestorm like waves on an ocean. The only other avenue of escape is a freight train at the edge of town. Women and children are lifted into wooden boxcars as flames threaten Matheson Station. Thelma Miles's mother is 8 years old at the time.
She didn't have any clothes on, hardly, except a little cotton dress. And she remembered running up with her mother up to the hill. There was about an inch of silt everywhere, and she remembered this silt coming up between her toes as she ran.
As the train starts to move, passengers stuff wet cloths in the cracks of the boxcars to keep the smoke out, screaming as the freight punches through the wall of flame.
Well, my mother recalls it was extremely hot because there were so many people pushed into this boxcar type of thing. And the burning wood on the outside of the train and everything, I guess it was a pretty scary ride.
Outside Matheson, William Dowson arrives at the homestead he shares with friend Les Hall. Les and his mother are building a shelter out of boxes and a wet tarpaulin.
The flames would mount hundreds of feet into the air, driving the smoke away for a moment and letting the sun shine down on us. But its light was a ghastly, pale death color, and I felt better when the smoke closed in again and shut it off.
At the Ginn homestead, Frank Ginn's wife and daughters huddle in the house as fire sweeps towards them. The heat is so intense that windows on the burning chicken coops melt into balls of glass. Hundreds of thousands of acres are now burning along the clay belt. The hardest hit is the village of Nushka, just north of Matheson. While some are able to escape by train, many more decide to stay.
The men chose to stay and the wives would not leave because they didn't want to leave their husbands. And they chose to stay because they wanted to fight for what they had already, their animals, their barns, their homes.
Kim McGuire's grandfather, Simon O'Mont, is working his quarter section outside Nushka when the fire hits. He races home to save his wife and 9 of their children. A 10th child, Irene, is not at home.
My mother was visiting her uncle, Joseph O'Mont, and his family, and he led them out of the house to the well, and they took blankets from the home and wet the blankets and covered themselves with the blanket and spent the duration of the fire in the well.
Not far away, the Gauthier family finds refuge in nearby Brown Lake.
One can imagine the terror they must have felt. The children's feet were becoming burned. It was smoky, thick smoke, hard to breathe. And so they had a flat-bottom boat, a punt, and they all got on the punt. Mrs. Gauthier became quite ill and unwell and kept fainting, and then the pump sank. The smoke still came at them. They pulled up their shirts and wetted them and put them over their heads and tried to breathe through the wet material.
In the village of Nushka, Father Wilfred Gagné rallies those left behind with a plan of escape.
Now, Father Gagné was a theologian and knew little of the mechanics of fire, but he had the very best of intentions. And they went into the clay cut. And when they got there, he advised them to lie down and get as low to the ground as possible, and as the fire roared over, hopefully they would be safe.
Farther south, the homestead shared by William Dowson and Les Hall is on fire, and the heat beneath their tarpaulin shelter is unbearable.
By this time, it was difficult to breathe. "Come on, Les, let's get out of this," I shouted, and disappeared into the smoke.
Dowson leaves the clearing, but very quickly finds himself sandwiched between 2 giant shafts of flame.
There's no smoke, it's all flame. My eyes are wide open and I can hardly see. Oh, if I was only back. It must be cool in the clearing. Yes, I will try. Oh God, will you help me?
July 29th, 1916. A storm of fire unleashes its fury on the clay belt between Matheson and Cochrane, Ontario. As quickly as the firestorm comes, it moves on, leaving behind a stark and gutted landscape. In the clearing that was once his homestead, the body of William Dowson lies in the clay of a potato patch.
When I opened my eyes again, I was looking up at a clear spot of sky straight above me. The bush was gone.
Dowson finds the makeshift shelter still intact. His friend Les Hall and Les's mother are still alive. Not far away, Frank Ginn arrives at his farm just outside Matheson. He finds his family safe.
Their place was built on a knoll, and the fire, for some reason, went around the knoll, and nothing was burned on their place.
On her uncle's farm, 5-year-old Irene Aumont has also survived. Unfortunately, as her father, Simon Aumont, has already discovered, Irene's own family has not been so lucky.
By the time he got to his home, his wife and the children had suffocated right behind the door. The youngest child was 4 months old and was still breathing. He picked him up in his arms and ran to the field with him. And on his way to the field, he tripped over some wire fencing and fell to the ground, and he lost consciousness. And when he woke up, it was night, and the baby had died.
Sunday, July 30th, 1916. The clay belt between Matheson and Cochrane is a smoldering ruin.
It will have been a desolate country. Of course, completely isolated. The fire burned ties on the railway. It could warp the rails themselves, and that happened to some extent. The fire burned poles for the telegraph lines, and so telegraph communication was out with points further north.
I went to see if anything remained of Matheson. There is nothing north of the tracks, and that was nearly all of Matheson. Swept away. All of it.
It would be a gutted out shell. The only thing you'd probably see would be if they had a stone foundation, it would be there.
There were 3 buildings, I think, 3 or 4 buildings that didn't get the fire.
One of those homes is the brick house of John Hugh. The Hugh family pitches in to help those less fortunate.
The house was standing and it was turned into a hospital, and so everything in the house was turned into bandages. And my mother, I remember, she had a bunch of goose grease stored away in the basement, and she would use this on the burns. So, yeah, so they were busy.
In just a few short hours, fire has devastated over 200,000 hectares of northern Ontario, its communities in ruins. Having survived in the shallow waters of Brown Lake, the Gauthier family heads for the village of Nushka in search of food and shelter.
And as they came near to Nushka, they noticed that the small community was no more, smouldering ashes. And so they went through the clay cut, which was just an opening that the railway had made through this small hill. Lying in that railway cut on either side were, well, dead bodies. There were 57 men, women, and children. They had asphyxiated. The rush of the fire had taken away the oxygen. And so they were all unmarked, and they were just lying there.
The greatest loss is that of Simon Aumont, who must say goodbye to his wife and 9 children. Only 5-year-old daughter Irene survives.
It was devastating for him to lose his family, and he was very thoughtful about how he wanted my mother's future to go, and he wanted her to be very well educated and be able to sustain herself because she would have no family around her.
The official death toll is 223, but many believe that number to be much higher.
There were people in the area who may not have been known to others. Unless there were survivors who knew them, they would have to settle for the fact that some of them were simply unknown. Just bodies without names.
Some blame the government for not providing adequate fire protection and for allowing the haphazard burning of land without supervision.
They were faced with mixed bush, mixed trees, and they did not have the manpower to cut them down, so they simply burned off parts of the land to clear the ground.
Within a year of the tragedy, the government passes the first Forest Fires Prevention Act, which lays the foundation for today's fire prevention legislation.
And the system of fire rangers was developed further, inspectors were appointed, the system of districts was refined, and the government moved towards close seasons, towards requiring permits from people before they set fires. And in these various ways, the Ontario government did try to prevent settlers' activities getting out of hand.
In 1920, the village of Nushka changes its name to Val-Gan in honor of the young priest who tried to save the lives of his parishioners on that terrible day in July 1916. Most of the surviving families remain in the area, accepting government assistance to rebuild their homes and their lives.
They always referred to the 1916 fire, and consequently the 29th of July I always remember, like a armistice day. They seemed to be quite proud, that like going through a war, that they come out of it, and they did the best they could.
By 1972, the fires of 1916 are a fading memory, even to those living along the clay belt of northern Ontario. In the Midwestern state of South Dakota, however, a different storm is brewing, one that will forever change the lives of families of a community known as Rapid City. Friday, June 9th, 1972. In Rapid City, South Dakota, members of the police force gather outside their Main Street headquarters for a departmental photograph. Shift Commander Tom Hennies is among them.
It was hot and sultry, no wind, and the sky, in my mind, most of the day was kind of a yellowish color. I remember that our uniforms really kind of stuck to us, like a wet sheet, in fact.
It's no surprise to anyone that the forecast calls for thunder showers. Rapid City receives more than its share of rainfall, particularly at this time of year.
Large convective thunderstorms can build up over the front range of the Black Hills, causing brief heavy rains, hail.
The Black Hills, where most of the rain in this area originates, is Rapid City's claim to fame. On this particular Friday, tourists look forward to one of the first weekends of the summer.
Tourism is a big part of our economy then and now in Rapid City, especially with the proximity of Mount Rushmore, which is just 25 miles out of town.
Rapid City gets its name from the creek that flows right through the center of town.
Rapid Creek originates in the north central Black Hills, fairly near the Wyoming border. Comes off the Black Hills and loses about 3,000 feet in elevation, dropping into Rapid City.
Once traditional camping grounds for the Lakota Nation, in 1972, the banks of Rapid Creek on the city's east side are home to many of their descendants, including 6-year-old Kevin Paniska and his family.
Many of our people were still living in substandard socioeconomic conditions. They were poor. And so they lived along the creek. Rapid Creek was our playground. We'd go and, throw rocks in the water and throw sticks in the water and catch tadpoles and stuff like that. Back in there was a trailer court back there, and we lived on the row on the side closest to the creek.
While this particular neighborhood is one of the community's poorest, that is not the case in other areas of the creek bed.
Back in 1972, living along Rapid Creek was the prime residential area in town.
A lot of residential properties, a lot of businesses, used car dealerships, significant amount of development at that time on the floodplain.
Russ Haley and his family have just moved into a brand new townhouse on the west end of Rapid City.
It was beautiful because you could always hear the creek as it was running, and well, we just never thought about a flood or never worried about it.
Flooding, like the rain, is a fact of life in Rapid City. In the 100 years leading up to 1972, there have been 25 recorded floods on Rapid Creek alone, resulting in the deaths of 28 people.
A flash flood is basically a flood that comes without warning. Winds aloft generally are pushing these storms, and they're moved out from their development over the Black Hills out onto the prairies and move along at a fairly good pace.
On this particular Friday, however, unusually light winds failed to push a developing storm system onto the prairie, trapping it directly over the Black Hills.
It was just a freak of nature that over the course of 6 hours, it rained an average of 10 inches on a 60 square mile area of the Black Hills.
14 kilometers above Rapid City, the huge Pactola Reservoir controls the discharge of water to the Rapid Creek Basin. But on June 9th, the heaviest rainfall occurs downstream between Pactola Dam and the much smaller Canyon Lake Reservoir on the western outskirts of Rapid City.
Heavy rains started in the central Black Hills, along Spring Creek, along Rapid Creek, Box Elder Creek. And by 6 p.m., state radio requested commercial radio and television stations to warn motorists about the potential of flooding in Boulder Canyon.
Flash flood warnings are soon expanded to include Rapid City. Canyon Lake resident Jim Lockhart doesn't need a flash flood warning to tell him what he already knows. He's gone out to help a neighbor evacuate his family.
When I came back, there was water running across across 44 coming out of Cleghorn Canyon, about hub deep on my vehicle.
The National Guard and local law enforcement are called into a state of readiness as the mayor issues a warning to the public calling for the evacuation of low-lying areas. But many, like Tom Henney's wife Ann, don't give the warning a second thought.
I called my wife and asked her to take the baby and get in the car and go to my folks' house. At that time, we lived just 100 feet from the creek. And she insisted that she would just stay upstairs. She was up in the bedroom and she was ironing, and she was just going to continue doing that and she'd be all right.
At their East Side trailer park, Kevin Paniska's mother, LaVaughn, is having the same difficulty persuading her husband that they might be at risk.
I kept looking out at the rain from inside the trailer, and it was coming down so hard you could hardly see across the street. And then on the TV news weather, it kept coming up that it was getting worse and worse. The way it was raining, I didn't trust the weather. So I told him I had to get out of there.
It wasn't no messing around. It was 1 second you're awake, and then in the next minute you're getting in the car and you're driving away.
They were crying because they were soaking wet from the rain, and all we had was what we wore out of the trailer.
By now, the creek is the highest that Tom Henney's has ever seen it. While he evacuates his own family, all he and his fellow officers can do is try to warn other Rapid City residents.
And we had sent cars down into the low-lying areas, using our loudspeakers on the cars and sirens to alert people that they needed to evacuate because the creek was coming up.
The rain that falls on the Black Hills that Friday night is 14 times the amount of water in the huge Pactola Reservoir. Now, runoff from that rain crests into a giant wall of water that boils down the Black Hills, headed for the smaller Canyon Lake Reservoir. Jim Lockhart knows what's coming and is having trouble getting home.
And I went down and the water was lapping at the side of that. I went across, I just got around the first curve and I saw white water coming down the road at me. And part of it got out ahead of me and I really had second thoughts about going back across that bridge because the water was running over the bridge by that time. Well, I went across and I made it. And less than 10 minutes later, the bridge is gone. I could hear the people across the creek over there hollering for help. And there wasn't nothing you could do.
The flood crest pouring down Rapid Creek is now 4 times greater than the worst flood on record, and it's headed straight for Rapid City.
My wife and my daughter, youngest daughter, was at home.
In their new townhouse, Russ Haley and his family are literally chased by the rising water.
They went right upstairs to the second floor, and I went out to the garage and cut off the electricity. It came so fast that by the time I reached the stairs to go upstairs, it was up to my knees in water, and it just kept coming.
It's just 15 minutes after midnight on June 10th, 1972, when a deadly wall of floodwater roars down the Black Hills, headed straight for the center of Rapid City, South Dakota.
This wall of water is described as anywhere from 5 to 10 feet high. Rapid City is at the mouth of a narrow canyon, and all that water came rushing through town and just scoured the landscape.
I've heard stories of people saying that it sounded like a freight train. You could actually hear houses crunching and snapping as they were knocked off their foundations.
LaVon Paniska and her children spend the night in their car on high ground, waiting for the storm to end. Not even Tom Hennies can foresee what is to come when he sends Officer Danny Wickard to warn homeowners on the west end of town.
He was a reserve officer, just a young kid who was doing community service. Well, Danny Wickard went across the bridge, and that's the last anybody ever saw of him alive.
Not far away, Russ Haley and his family are running for their lives.
The three of us went out on the deck, and it was raining and slippery and cold. I managed somehow to get my wife and my young daughter up on the roof. But I couldn't get up there because it was too slippery and there was no one to give me a boost.
When Russ sees a neighbor's deck crushed by the floating roof of a house, he realizes that the same thing could happen to him.
I jumped for a tree that was out there and grabbed a branch. The branch broke and I ended up in the water. And I was able to catch a branch of the tree. Then finally I worked my way up.
Meanwhile, police officer Tom Hennies gets into trouble himself on his way to answer a call for help from a flooded nursing home.
I realized that I was floating. But there was a fire truck coming. They'd received the same call. I looked up and here came a house down the street. The dispatcher told me later that he remembered when I called in and said, you know, you're not going to believe this, but I'm about to get hit by a house.
Tom leaves his patrol car to help other stranded motorists get away from the approaching house.
And it was about 3 feet of water we were in, and it was gushing very fast. That house finally hit the police car, and a piece of it broke off, and it hit me, and I got caught underneath of that thing. 5 or 6 times I got my head out of the water, but I could not get footing because of the weight of this thing and the water pushing me along. Finally, as we went by this fire truck, somebody on the back of the fire truck reached down and grabbed me by the collar and pulled me out of the water, out from under that roof or porch or whatever. And I got up on the back of the fire truck.
The weight of the heavy fire truck keeps it stable as it moves up the flooded street. But there is little those on board can do to help people trapped by the rushing current.
And I remember those little kids sitting up on top of those houses, screaming for help. Their folks obviously had put them up there to keep them safe. There was no way we could get to them. We had no ropes, no equipment, nothing.
For the moment, Tom Hennies is unable to help anyone in trouble. But Jim Lockhart can, and he continues to search for people stranded in flooded homes in Canyon Lake.
I had to wade down into water. It was right up under your armpits, and it was coming fast. You get to walk across there to get to a house. I was scared to death, but there was people in there, and you had to do what you had to do.
I certainly can remember clinging to that tree and the lightning flashing and the steam coming off my body. And of course, worrying about this house possibly collapsing with my wife and my young daughter up there.
Rapid City is not the only community under siege. At its peak, extreme flooding covers an area 65 kilometers long and 30 kilometers wide along the eastern slopes of the Black Hills from Sturgis to Hermosa.
The rainfall was so widespread and it fell in such a large area that a number of watersheds flooded, although it's safe to say that Rapid City had by far the most damage and loss of life in the flood.
The full extent of that damage becomes tragically clear in the light of dawn. Rapid Creek is once again within its banks, but the city is covered in a haze of smoke and death.
People who went out to see what had happened saw all the devastation. It was a Saturday morning and I was supposed to be on duty to put out the Saturday paper. I stopped at the intersection where I always stop and looked left for traffic, and there was a house sitting 100 feet away in the middle of the road. And I turned right and drove downtown towards work at the newspaper. I could smell it. It just smelled like mud and dust all in one, and yet kind of a decaying, death-like smell even then.
1/5 of Rapid City is covered in mud and debris. 80 city blocks of pavement have been ripped apart, and over 8 kilometers of railway track have been washed out. Hundreds of homes and thousands of vehicles are strewn across the floodplain. On the west edge of the city, Russ Haley is rescued from the tree where he has spent the last 7 hours. Thankfully, Russ's wife and daughter, and even their townhouse, have also survived. On the opposite side of town, at their Creekside trailer park, Kevin Paniska and his family discover that they are not so fortunate.
Just everything was water-soaked, water-drenched. Trailers all stacked up on top of each other into big old piles, and some of them are gone. And, people looking through, scavenging for what used to be their personal belongings, scavenging to hold on to something that's, for the most part, not there no more. Your life, the way it was, in a matter of hours, is turned upside down. It's totally different. It's gone.
Bodies are everywhere, and thousands of Rapid City residents are missing. Steps are taken immediately to organize a citywide search and rescue operation. It becomes clear that the number of dead is much higher than even Tom Hennies imagined.
I told my mother and my wife, I'll bet we've lost 50 people. Little did I know that we would have lost 238 before we were done counting.
Victims range in age from 3 months to 94 years. They include 3 members of the National Guard, 3 city firefighters, and 2 policemen, all killed while trying to warn or rescue people during the height of the flood. Over 3,000 survivors are injured, and many more are homeless. More than 1,300 residences are demolished, and some 240 businesses are damaged or completely destroyed.
Price tag for the disaster was put at $160 million in 1972. That would be about $660 million plus in today's dollar market.
It was just a basic survival needs time. I remember that we had to go downtown to City Hall. They had water trucks down there. And we'd go down there with our water containers and get water for our basic, sustenance. I remember everybody had to go down and get vaccinated. And I remember everything was a long line to get clothing vouchers and apply for housing.
While the Red Cross, the National Guard, and other organizations take care of short-term needs, Rapid City and the American government take steps for long-term recovery and flood protection plans. $70 million of disaster assistance pours into Rapid City from federal and state governments, as well as millions more in low-interest rebuilding loans. Within 2 months of the flood, city officials begin acquiring property along Rapid Creek and relocating homes and businesses that would no longer be allowed on the floodplain.
After the flood, with the establishment of a floodplain, and Rapid Creek became a strip of recreational area through town.
And what you have now is a beautiful park that runs through the entire city. There are all kinds of recreational facilities in the floodway, but there are no structures that can wash off.
Advances in communications and technology also improve, including the installation of flood monitors along Rapid Creek that measure rainfall and rising stream flows.
Today we have much quicker communications, and with the availability of Doppler radar and the flood warning system, that information stream is sped up considerably.
All of this is in preparation for the next big flood, which many believe can and will happen again.
We have the experience of having been through this before. We know that we're not going to put people in harm's way, and we're not going to allow people to go in harm's way. And I think that the community is in such a position, within the community anyway, that we're all going to be safe.
In towns and cities across Canada, fire is still a fact of life, a powerful force that brings with it death and destruction. In Northern Ontario, as in other regions, there have been many improvements in fire prediction, suppression, and management. Still, residents can only hope that a disaster the likes of the Matheson fire will never happen again.
In Black River Matheson, we have like 60 volunteer firefighters. We have 4 fire stations. We have equipment that is well served. So no, there's never been a threat that way. And if there were, we'd be in a position to address it.
Several memorials in Rapid City commemorate the flood of 1972. But most involved in the disaster carry their own memories of that terrible night.
To this day, if we have a thunderstorm and I wake up and see the lightning and hear the thunder, I can smell that mud and I can hear that flood, and I would assume that everybody else that was in it experiences the same thing.
Oh, I had dreams of floods for 5 years after the floods. You worry a lot, that it'll happen again. And I think the flood made me that way. I'll always be afraid.
What I've learned from my life here in Rapid City is that I've got to rebuild myself, and I've got to rebuild my community. My higher power had said that we were supposed to survive that. And I don't have an explanation for that, but just that there's, a higher power, a supreme force that makes these things happen.